Hey guys, so in this video I'm going to show you how I create a local MySQL database which is populated with real-time glucose data from Dexcom. Now I've been meaning to do this project for a while and I finally got around to it, and I wanted to do it for a couple of reasons. Firstly, just having a backup of my glucose data I thought was important because if I ever change CGM provider, I wanted to make sure I wouldn't lose all of that useful historic data. And secondly is having the opportunity to sort of slice and dice the data in different ways, analyze it, and help me better keep on track with my diabetes. The setup that I've built consists of a Raspberry Pi 4, and within that I'm running a MySQL database, which is where the data is going to get pushed into. And I also use a tool called Node-RED, which is pre-installed on Raspbian, and that's going to facilitate the capture of data from the Dexcom servers and into the local database as and when it appears. So we should see as more data gets sent to the Dexcom servers, more data gets populated into our local database. Okay, enough chat, let's get into the setup. I've got my Raspberry Pi 4 booted up and connected up to a display. And the first thing I'm going to do is open up a terminal window, which is by clicking this icon in the top left, and I'm going to run two commands to update any system packages that need to be updated before we get going with our setup. So the two commands I'm going to run is sudo apt-get update followed by sudo apt-get upgrade. This may take a few minutes to complete on your system depending on how many upgrades you've got to do. Once I've done that, I can go ahead and close the terminal and click on the Raspberry in the top left, and underneath the programming menu you can see that Node-RED is already installed, so there's not too much we need to do to set this up. We can go ahead and click it. It will open up a console which has launched the Node-RED process, and it contains a URL which I'm going to copy and then open up a web browser so that we can navigate to the web interface. So click the blue globe. I'm going to copy and paste the URL into the address bar and go ahead and launch the Node-RED process. So we can see here it's just loading up now, and voila, here we are. So this is the Node-RED interface. Effectively, this is where we're going to actually import our flow, which pulls data from Dexcom on a regular basis and pushes it into a MySQL server. Okay, so now we are ready to import our flow. So we can open up a new browser tab and head on over to the GitHub repository, which I've linked in the comment of this video, and then you'll find a dexcom-pull.json file which defines the flow that we want to import. I can actually go ahead and just triple click, right click, copy that, head back to the Node-RED tab, and then in the top right there's three vertical bars. I'm just going to click that, click import, and then I can actually just go ahead and paste that JSON file straight in there, and then click import, and hopefully that should bring in our flow. So we can see it's imported one flow, 11 nodes, and there's some unrecognized types. We'll deal with that in a second. And we have a new tab appearing here, which is the Dexcom pull tab, and that's what's going to be pulling the data and putting it into our database. So we can see some of the edges between the nodes have got some dashed lines. That's because we need to install a couple of extra nodes which don't come pre-installed with Node-RED. So I can click on the three horizontal bars menu and then click Manage Palette, and within that I'm able to install extra nodes that I need for this particular flow. So I can navigate to the Install tab within the Manage Palette menu, and then inside there I'm going to search for the Credentials module and go ahead and install that. And the second one that I'm going to need is the MySQL node. Go ahead, add that, install that, and now we should see, after we close this palette and we've installed that package, we should see that those nodes now no longer have dotted edges. So yes, looks much better. The other thing that I need to do is also install an extra node package which I've made use of inside this flow. And because it's a node dependency, I need to navigate to the home directory of Node-RED, which is home.node-red, and within that we can use npm to install the package that we want. So I can just npm I, and then the library that I'm after is called SQL template strings. It allows me to create the MySQL query. I'm just going to go ahead and install that. In order to make that accessible inside the flow, I have to actually edit the settings file, settings.js file, which is actually in the same directory. So I can go ahead and open that up using nano, and I'm going to navigate down until I see a line called, oh yeah, function global context. So this is where we need to define any external dependencies that we want to make available to the Node-RED. So I'm going to put in here just an alias SQL module require, and then SQL template strings, and then we can Control X, save that, and we need to do a quick reboot of the Node-RED server, so we can just run Node-RED restart in order for that setting to take effect. Refresh the browser, and we are all done with the dependencies. The next thing we need to do is edit our credentials node. So we can double click on the padlock credentials node, and here we need to put in our account name and password for Dexcom. This is going to allow us to authenticate with the Dexcom servers so that we can pull the data down. So I'm just going to add in my account name, click done, and now we are ready to start setting up the database. So we need to actually go ahead and install MySQL. So I'm going to go back to the terminal, and actually there isn't a version of MySQL that is available for Raspberry Pi directly, so we actually go ahead and install a MariaDB server, which actually has all the same commands available to it as MySQL. So after that install using sudo apt-get is done, I'm going to then sudo service MySQL start, which will start up the database, and then I'm going to run a program called MySQL secure installation, which just allows me to set up a root password for the database. If this is the first time you're running it, it will be blank. For me, I had already set it up before, so it just required me to put my password from before. I encourage you to set a strong root password. The remaining questions of the wizard, I just answered yes to all of those. So now we've configured the password for our database, we can actually use the MySQL command line tool to actually connect to our database. We'll need to put in the root password again, and then we should see we're now connected to the MariaDB MySQL. First thing we need to do, create a database. I called mine diabetes, and we then can use the use command to actually connect to that particular database. And then within the database, we need to actually create a table, which is going to store the glucose data. So I'm going to write here, create table glucose, that's the name of the table. And then it's going to be really simple. I'm just going to have 3 columns. The first one is date, which is going to be a date time. And it's also going to be the primary key for the database. Second one is value, which is going to be the actual glucose value, so the number, and that's going to be a float. And then finally direction is going to be where the glucose is heading, so steady, up, down. So I can just run that query and then Control D to return to the console. So we've now created all of the tables and artifacts we need in MySQL. Heading back to the Node-RED interface, we can double click on the MySQL node, click the pencil icon, and we can configure our database credentials. So we put in the root user, and then we add in the root password for our database, and then we select the database as diabetes and click done. And now we can see a green light indicating that our database node has indeed connected to our MySQL. And we are now at the point where we can actually test our flow. So I'm actually going to delete one of the edges by clicking and pressing delete after the clean glucose data, and add an inject node from the left hand panel or rather a debug node, sorry, not an inject, and connect that up to the clean glucose data, and that will allow me to see the data that's flowing through without writing to the database. So I can click deploy on the top right hand menu, which will actually update, deploy the specific flow, and then I can head to the debug menu, which is the little bug which shows the outputs from the debug nodes, and then I can click my inject node, which will actually trigger the entire workflow. So if I go ahead and click that, I can see some glucose data is flowing through the system. Fantastic. So everything looks good. I can see JSON messages coming out. So I'm going to actually go ahead and delete that edge and that debug node there, and I'm going to reconnect up my flow and hit deploy again. And now we can see at the point at which I deploy, the flow has run again and actually should have inserted some data into the database. I'm just going to pop back to the MySQL console, connect up to my database, and just run a select statement on my table, and I should be able to see some glucose values in there. Fantastic. Yep, I can see that's being populated. Glucose is had high, just had some food, but that's otherwise all good. And so yeah, the final thing we need to do is just head to the inject node, double click on that, and where it says inject once, I'm actually going to deselect that tick box, and I'm going to set an interval. So I want this to run automatically every 150 seconds and just pull the glucose from the Dexcom servers and add into the database any new values that appear. So that's it. We can click deploy. We're pretty much done, and that should just be running. The final thing I would recommend doing is actually opening up a terminal and running the following command, which will actually set up Node-RED to run as a service. Now this is really useful because if the Pi decides to reboot after an upgrade or whatever, it means it will automatically get started the next time you start up Raspbian. Turns out we don't need to do the same for MySQL because the way we set it up was already as a service, so that will automatically get rebooted if the Pi reboots. So we are now done. We can actually go ahead and close the browser. Everything will continue to run, and as new glucose data appears, it will get pushed into the database as and when that data is available. And so we can periodically check our MySQL and ensure that the data is coming in, but we are there and everything looks good. So that concludes the setup of our local glucose store. If you found the video useful or interesting, please feel free to like or subscribe to my channel, and I would love to hear how you get on setting up your own versions of this setup.